You know, they say grief is a heavy thing, a fog that rolls in and blinds you. But for me, on the worst day of my life, grief didn't blind me, it sharpened me. Picture this. I'm standing in a cemetery. The air is thin and cold, the kind of Colorado chill that bites right through your suit. And I'm watching my father's casket being lowered into the frozen earth, trying to say a final goodbye to the man who taught me how to hold a hammer, how to read a blueprint, how to stand my ground. But I couldn't focus on the eulogy, I couldn't focus on the tears, because 40 miles away, at that exact moment, a diesel engine was roaring to life on my property. My phone was vibrating in my pocket, over and over again, a frantic rhythm against my leg. And when I finally checked it, I saw a video stream that made my blood run colder than the grave dirt. It was Victoria Sterling, the president of the Summit Creek Reserve Homeowners Association, holding her phone up, filming with this twisted look of satisfaction, while a massive yellow bulldozer clawed its way through the front of my house. Not just a house, but my sanctuary, the timber frame masterpiece I spent 18 months building with my own hands after my wife, Elena, passed away, the place where I healed, where I learned to breathe again. I watched on that tiny screen as the steel bucket smashed into the custom stone fireplace, the same stones my dad and I had handpicked from the riverbed 2 summers ago. And as the chimney crumbled into dust, Victoria smirked at the camera, thinking she had finally won, thinking she had crushed the spirit of the stubborn engineer who refused to bow to her petty tyranny. But Victoria made a miscalculation, a fatal error in her structural analysis of who I was, because she didn't know that while she was playing checkers with bylaws, I was playing 4D chess with state statutes. She didn't realize that by destroying my home, she hadn't broken me, she had liberated me, she had turned a grieving son into a weapon of mass legal destruction. My name is Silas Vance. I'm a 52-year-old structural engineer, and this is the story of how a corrupt HOA tried to bury me, so I legally wiped their entire district off the map. To understand the rage, you have to understand the paradise I lost. Summit Creek Reserve was supposed to be heaven. 3 acres of pine forest and granite cliffs, a place where the wind whispered through the ponderosa pines and the eagles rode the thermals above the valley floor. After Elena lost her battle with cancer, I poured my grief into concrete and timber, building a home that was part of the ecosystem, not an intrusion on it. Solar panels, rainwater collection, a native wildflower garden that exploded with color every spring. It was quiet, it was peaceful, until the day a white Mercedes G-Wagon rolled up my driveway and Victoria Sterling stepped out, looking like she had just walked off a reality TV set, clutching an iPad like it was the 10 Commandments. She wasn't alone. She had her enforcer with her, a guy named Brock Halloway, an ex-mall cop who patrolled the neighborhood in a golf cart modified with police lights, measuring grass height with a ruler and handing out fines like he was judge, jury, and executioner. The attack started small, a certified letter demanding $500 for unauthorized landscaping, claiming my native wildflowers were weeds that violated community aesthetic standards. I tried to be reasonable. I went to the hearing. I brought data showing that native plants save water and increase property value. But Victoria didn't even look at my report. She just filed her nails and said, "Rules are rules, Mr. Vance. Weeds are weeds." And then she doubled the fine to $1,000. That was the moment the engineer in me woke up, because engineers don't just accept failure. We analyze the stress points. We look for the cracks in the foundation. I started talking to my neighbors, people like Mrs. Higgins, a retired librarian who was terrified because Brock was photographing her garden through her kitchen window, and Sergeant Miller, a Vietnam vet who was being fined for parking his truck at a 17-degree angle instead of parallel. I realized this wasn't about property values. This was about control. It was suburban fascism wrapped in a restrictive covenant, and Victoria was the dictator. So, I did what any good engineer does. I went back to the source code. I drove to the county clerk's office and pulled the original covenants for Summit Creek Reserve, the dusty, yellowed documents from the 80s, not the shiny new PDFs Victoria kept emailing everyone. And there, buried in Section 12, Subsection 4, I found my first weapon, a clause that explicitly allowed seasonal plants for aesthetic enhancement. Now, biologically speaking, botanically speaking, and legally speaking, tomatoes are fruits, and they are seasonal, and they are plants. The next board meeting was a slaughter. Victoria sat at the head of the table, flanked by Brock and a wildlife expert, who turned out to be her yoga instructor's boyfriend, claiming my vegetable garden attracted vermin. When it was my turn, I didn't just argue. I introduced my own expert, Dr. Eris Thorne, a literal ecologist from the State University, who testified that my garden actually repelled pests and supported the local ecosystem. Then I dropped the hammer, quoting the original covenants about seasonal plants, and asking Victoria, in front of the entire room, if she was legally declaring that vegetables were not plants. The room went dead silent, the kind of silence where you can hear a pin drop, and for the first time, I saw the neighbors, people like Chloe, a young mom who had been bullied for her kids' chalk drawings, actually smile. We won that skirmish, but I had started a war, and Victoria wasn't the type to surrender. She was the type to scorch the earth. The harassment escalated immediately. Brock started parking his golf cart at the edge of my property at 6 a.m. every morning, just sitting there, watching me drink my coffee, documenting the duration of my Christmas lights or the placement of my doormat. They came after my solar panels next, slapping me with a $15,000 removal order based on a rule passed in a secret meeting held on Christmas Eve morning, a meeting where only 3 people voted. But here's the thing about bullies. They get sloppy, they get arrogant. I started digging into Victoria's finances, into the contractors she forced everyone to use, and I found out that the approved roofing company was owned by her brother, and the approved landscaper was Brock's cousin. It was a racket, a classic kickback scheme hiding behind the veneer of a respectable neighborhood. But I needed more than just suspicion. I needed a smoking gun. I needed to find the structural failure that would bring the whole house of cards down. And late one night, with maps spread out over my dining room table, the smell of old paper mixing with the scent of wood smoke, I found something that made my heart stop. A discrepancy in the boundary lines that didn't make any sense. A line on the map that shouldn't have been there. You have to understand, finding a surveying error in a legal description is like finding a glitch in the matrix. It changes the reality of everything you're looking at. I was staring at the original subdivision plat from 1987, the one with the official county seal and the surveyor's wet signature, and then I looked at the colorful, glossy map Victoria Sterling handed out to new residents. They didn't match. According to the official legal documents filed with the state, the Summit Creek Reserve HOA ended 200 feet before my driveway. I sat there in the silence of my workshop, listening to the hum of the solar inverters, the ones Victoria wanted to tear down, and the realization hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't in the HOA. I never had been. For 4 years, I had been paying fees, paying fines, asking for permission to plant flowers on my own land, and bowing to a dictator who had absolutely zero legal authority over me. And it wasn't just me. I grabbed a ruler and started tracing the lines, doing the math, and my stomach dropped when I realized the scope of the fraud. There were 24 homes, half the neighborhood, sitting outside the legal boundaries. Victoria had been running a phantom empire, collecting hundreds of thousands of dollars in illegal fees, managing properties she didn't govern, and terrorizing families who were essentially free citizens. I called Mrs. Higgins immediately, and we spent the next 3 days at the county assessor's office, digging through archives that smelled like vinegar and dust. We found the expansion documents from 1994, the paperwork that supposedly doubled the size of the HOA, and they were a joke. No notary seals, missing signatures, a meeting minutes log that showed only 12 people voted when a supermajority of 36 was required. It was fraud, plain and simple, a 30-year-old lie that everyone had just accepted because nobody checks the foundation once the house is built. We formed a secret coalition, moving our meetings from the community center to my workshop to avoid Brock Holloway surveillance, calling ourselves the Summit Truth Group. We had Sergeant Miller organizing the logistics, Chloe handling the communications, and Mrs. Higgins becoming our historian, documenting every inconsistency. But Victoria sensed the shift in the wind. She knew something was brewing. She ramped up the pressure, hitting me with a nuisance lawsuit on Thanksgiving morning, claiming my conspiracy theories were damaging property values and demanding $50,000 in damages. It was psychological warfare. Brock started following Chloe to the grocery store, taking photos of her kids, trying to intimidate the weakest links in our chain, but he didn't realize that pressure creates diamonds, and he was just solidifying our resolve. We hired Evelyn Sharp, the sharkiest property rights attorney in Denver, a woman who looked at our evidence and actually laughed, saying, "This isn't a lawsuit, Silas, this is a demolition." We were preparing a class action suit, a quiet title action to prove the boundaries, and a petition to dissolve the entire district based on fraudulent formation. But then, the universe threw a wrench in the gears. My father, Arthur, passed away. The man was my bedrock, the one who told me, measure twice, cut once. And suddenly I was planning a funeral instead of a legal strategy. Victoria knew it, too. Brock had been tracking my movements. He knew exactly when the service was. He knew I would be 40 miles away, defenseless. That's when she decided to execute the nuclear option, invoking an emergency structural hazard clause to demolish my home while I was burying my dad. Which brings us back to the cemetery, standing there with the phone in my hand, watching the bulldozers smash my dad's stonework. I wanted to scream, I wanted to vomit, but then I heard Sergeant Miller's voice on the other end of the line. "We got him, Silas. We're blocking the road." I ran to my truck, leaving the reception, tearing down the mountain highway like a madman, forcing my Ford F-150 around curves meant for sports cars. When I screeched into my driveway, the scene was chaos, but it was beautiful chaos. Sergeant Miller and 3 other veterans had used their pickup trucks to barricade the bulldozer. They were standing there with arms crossed, staring down the contractor. Brock Holloway was screaming, waving a piece of paper, but the heavy machinery had stopped. I jumped out of my truck, adrenaline dumping into my system, and walked straight up to the demolition foreman. "Show me the permit," I roared. "Show me the court order." The guy looked terrified. He handed me a work order signed by Victoria Sterling, paid for with a personal check from her business account. No county permit. No engineering report. Just a warlord ordering a hit. The police arrived minutes later. Real police, not rent-a-cops. And when they saw the lack of permits, the mood shifted instantly. They weren't there to arrest me. They were looking at the contractor, looking at Brock. That was the moment the dam broke. The local news had picked up the story. HOA tries to bulldoze home during funeral. And by the time the sun set, satellite trucks were parked on the street. Victoria had tried to break me in private, but she had just invited the entire world to witness her crime. We didn't just have a legal case anymore. We had a revolution. I looked at the half-crushed fireplace, the dust settling on the snow, and I knew it was time to finish this. Not just for me, but for the 24 families she had held hostage for decades. The fall of Victoria Sterling wasn't a slow decline. It was a structural collapse, sudden and catastrophic. We didn't just sue her. We nuked the entire concept of her authority. The hearing was scheduled at the county commissioner's office, a massive room that was usually empty, but that night it was packed with 200 angry residents, news crews, and a team of lawyers from national property rights organizations who had flown in just to watch the show. Evelyn Sharp walked to the podium and didn't say a word for a full minute. She just set up a large easel and unveiled the map, the real map, the 1987 map. She traced the red line of the legal boundary, leaving half the room, including my property, clearly outside the district. Then she played the audio recordings we'd gotten from a whistleblower, a maintenance worker who Victoria had ordered to cut the utility lines of problem residents. You could hear Victoria's voice, clear as day, instructing him to make it look like an accident. The room erupted. The commissioners looked like they had swallowed lemons. Victoria, sitting in the front row in her power suit, turned pale, then gray. She tried to stand up, tried to shout about community standards and property values, but the sheriff, a stern man who had seen our evidence beforehand, gently placed a hand on her shoulder and sat her back down. Then came the financial audit. Evelyn displayed charts showing $340,000 in illegal fees funneled into Victoria's roofing company and rental properties over 8 years. It wasn't just mismanagement, it was grand larceny. The climax came when Brock Holloway, who had been arrested hiding at his sister's house in Wyoming 3 days prior, had his confession read into the record. He flipped on her completely, detailing the stalking, the vandalism of my mailbox, the coordination with the corrupt bulldozer contractor. It was over. The commissioners voted unanimously to dissolve the Summit Creek Reserve HOA immediately. They declared all covenants null and void for the expansion area and ordered the freezing of all assets for restitution. Seeing Victoria being led out of the meeting in handcuffs, trying to shield her face from the flashing cameras, didn't feel like joy. It felt like relief. It felt like waking up from a long, feverish nightmare. She was eventually sentenced to 18 months in federal prison for mail fraud and conspiracy, in order to pay over $1 million in restitution and punitive damages. Brock got 6 months in probation. But the real ending of this story isn't the legal victory, it's what happened to the mountain. 6 months later, Summit Creek is unrecognizable. The fear is gone. The property values actually shot up 15% because people wanted to live in a neighborhood without a tyrant. My native plant garden? It's thriving, a riot of purple and gold against the green pines, and it's become a sort of symbol for the neighborhood. We used the settlement money, the punitive damages we squeezed out of Victoria's estate, to start a community fund. We don't have a board, we don't have rules, we have a tool library where my workshop used to be private. Neighbors help neighbors fix fences not because they have to, but because they want to. Mrs. Higgins hosts potlucks. Sergeant Miller organizes snow removal for the elderly. We built a real community out of the wreckage of a fake one. I rebuilt the fireplace, by the way. It took me all summer, choosing each stone carefully, thinking about my dad with every placement. It's stronger now, reinforced, just like us. And sometimes, when I'm sitting on my deck drinking coffee from my handmade mug, looking out over the valley where the eagles still soar, I think about the nature of power. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? Why do we let these little dictators run our lives? Why do we sign away our freedom for the promise of a uniform aesthetic? We traded community for conformity, and it took a bulldozer to wake us up. There is a difference between a neighborhood and a community. One is drawn on a map, the other is built on trust. We wiped their district off the state map, sure, but what we really did was put ourselves back on the map of humanity. So, look at your own situation. Read your documents. Check your boundaries. And never, ever let someone tell you that a tomato isn't a plant. Because if you give them an inch of your freedom, they'll take a mile of your soul. Justice isn't given, it's engineered. And sometimes, you have to tear the whole house down to build it right. But what do you think? Was destroying the entire HOA the only way? Or did we go too far? Does your neighborhood have a Victoria Sterling lurking in the shadows? Let me know in the comments. I'm Silas Vance, and this has been a story of ruin and reconstruction. Stay vigilant.